The pipe wrench slipped from my greasy fingers and clattered against the basement floor, echoing through the cramped space like a gunshot. Above me, water dripped steadily from the joint I'd been wrestling with for the past hour, each drop landing on my forehead with the persistence of Chinese water torture. "Gerald, what are you doing down there?" Lorraine's voice drifted down from the kitchen, carrying that familiar note of irritation that had become her default tone when addressing me. "Fixing your precious plumbing," I muttered, wiping my hands on my jeans. The basement of our fixer-upper house had become my refuge, a place where I could actually accomplish something without her commentary on my methods. I heard her heels clicking across the hardwood floor above, then the familiar creak of the floorboard by the kitchen table. She was settling in for one of her evening phone calls, the ones that had become increasingly frequent over the past few months. "Oh, you know how it is," she laughed, her voice carrying that musical quality she reserved for people who weren't me. "These work dinners just drag on, but Victor insists on discussing every detail of the quarterly projections." Victor Ashworth. Her boss, the golden boy CEO of Ashworth Industries, the man who'd supposedly recognized Lorraine's exceptional talents and promoted her to executive assistant 6 months ago. The same man whose name had started appearing in our conversations with increasing regularity. I positioned myself directly under the heating vent, where the sound carried perfectly from the kitchen above. Call it paranoia, but 20 years of marriage had taught me that when your wife starts having more intimate conversations with her boss than with you, it's time to pay attention. No, he's downstairs playing with his tools," Lorraine continued, and I could practically hear her rolling her eyes. "You know Gerald, always tinkering with something that was working perfectly fine before he touched it." The laugh that followed made my stomach clench. It wasn't the polite chuckle she used for telemarketers or the dry humor she employed with her friends. This was something else entirely, warm, conspiratorial, intimate. I climbed the wooden stairs slowly, each step planned to minimize creaking. The kitchen door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see Lorraine perched on the edge of our dining table, her legs crossed, her free hand playing with the pearl necklace I'd given her for our anniversary. "Oh, Victor, you're terrible," she whispered, covering the phone's mouthpiece as she giggled. "I can't believe you said that to Henderson in the board meeting." My hand tightened around the pipe wrench. Victor. Not Mr. Ashworth, not her boss, just Victor. Like they were old friends, like they shared inside jokes about board meetings and quarterly projections. I pushed through the door, making enough noise to announce my presence. Lorraine's head snapped up, her eyes widening for just a fraction of a second before her expression smoothed into practiced innocence. "Listen, I need to run," she said into the phone, her voice shifting to its professional register. "Yes, I'll have those reports ready first thing Monday. Have a good weekend, Mr. Ashworth." She ended the call and set the phone on the table, giving me her brightest smile. "All finished with your project?" "For now." I held up the wrench, studying her face. "Work call?" You know how demanding Victor can be about deadlines." She slid off the table and moved toward the refrigerator, her movements just a touch too casual. "He wanted to make sure I understood the presentation requirements for next week's client meeting." "Sounds important." "Oh, it is. This contract could mean big things for the company, and for me, potentially." She pulled out a bottle of white wine, something expensive I didn't remember buying. "Victor says I have real executive potential." "I'm sure he does." Something in my tone must have registered because she paused, the wine bottle halfway to the counter. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. Just that it's nice to have a boss who appreciates your talents." She studied my face for a long moment, then laughed, that same musical sound I'd heard through the heating vent. "Gerald Tate, are you jealous?" "Should I be? Of my career success?" "I hope not." She uncorked the wine with practiced efficiency. I know it's been an adjustment, me working late more often, but this opportunity could change everything for us. The raise alone would cover the mortgage payments for the next 2 years. She poured herself a generous glass, didn't offer me one. Another small change in the pattern of our marriage, like the new perfume she'd started wearing, or the way she'd begun styling her hair differently. These work dinners, I said, leaning against the counter, they happen pretty regularly. Not that often. Maybe once or twice a week. She took a sip of wine, her eyes not quite meeting mine. Victor likes to discuss strategy in a more relaxed environment. Says the office atmosphere stifles creative thinking. Relaxed environment. Restaurant settings usually, sometimes the country club. She moved past me toward the living room, wine glass in hand. Nothing fancy, just business. I followed her, watching the way she settled into her favorite armchair, the one that faced away from the couch where I usually sat. What kind of restaurants? Gerald, what is this? 20 questions? Her laugh had an edge now, sharper than before. I don't interrogate you about every job site you visit or every client meeting you attend. My client meetings don't involve dinner and wine. Because you're a contractor, not a corporate executive. The words came out harsher than she'd probably intended, and she immediately softened her tone. I mean, we work in different worlds. The expectations are different. Different worlds. That phrase had been appearing in her vocabulary more frequently lately, usually when she was explaining why I wouldn't understand something about her job, or why I wouldn't fit in at some company function. Right, I said. Different worlds. She sipped her wine and reached for the remote control, effectively ending the conversation. The evening news flickered to life, filling the silence between us with reports of traffic accidents and political scandals. I watched her for a few minutes, noting the way she kept glancing at her phone, how her fingers drummed against the armrest in a rhythm that suggested impatience. She was waiting for something, or someone. I'm going to grab a shower, I announced. She didn't look away from the television. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, but instead of heading for the bathroom, I positioned myself at the top of the staircase where I could hear the living room clearly. Sure enough, within 30 seconds of my footsteps disappearing down the hallway, I heard her phone chime with an incoming text, then another, and another. Her soft laughter drifted up the stairs, followed by the rapid tapping of fingers on a keyboard. She was texting back, and from the sound of it, the conversation was entertaining. I gave it 5 more minutes, then made a show of turning on the shower, letting the water run while I crept back to the top of the stairs. Lorraine was no longer in the living room. Her voice came from the kitchen, low and intimate. I know, but he's right upstairs, she was saying. We have to be careful. Careful about what? Business presentations? Quarterly reports? Tuesday works for me. The usual place? A pause, then that laugh again. You're incorrigible, Victor Ashworth. Absolutely incorrigible. I felt something shift inside my chest, a cold certainty settling into place like a key turning in a lock. This wasn't about work dinners or executive potential or quarterly projections. This was about my wife having conversations with another man that she couldn't have with me in the room. The shower was still running, steam beginning to seep under the bathroom door. I turned off the water and actually took the shower I'd pretended to need, using the time to think through what I'd heard and what it might mean. When I came back downstairs 20 minutes later, Lorraine was back in her chair, wine glass refilled, watching a cooking show with apparent fascination. Her phone was face down on the side table, silent and innocent. Feel better? She asked without looking at me. Much. I settled onto the couch, close enough to study her profile. What are you watching? Something about French pastries. Probably too complicated for home cooking, but it's interesting to see the technique. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, but I could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a furnace. She kept checking the time on the cable box display, and twice I caught her glancing toward her phone. "Early day tomorrow?" I asked. "Saturday meeting. Victor wants to review the Henderson presentation before Monday's client lunch." She finished her wine and stood up, smoothing her skirt. "I should probably get to bed soon. Need to be sharp tomorrow." "What time's the meeting?" 10 o'clock. Shouldn't take more than a few hours." She moved toward the stairs, then paused. "What about you? Any weekend projects planned?" "Thought I might finish that basement plumbing. Maybe organize the garage." "Sounds productive." She climbed 3 steps, then turned back. "Oh, I might be late tomorrow night. Victor mentioned possibly extending the meeting into dinner if we need more time to prepare." There it was. Another work dinner, mentioned casually like an afterthought, but delivered with the careful precision of someone who'd been planning the conversation. "Of course," I said. "Important presentation." "Exactly." She smiled, and for just a moment, it looked like the smile I'd fallen in love with 20 years ago. Then she disappeared upstairs, and I heard the bedroom door close with a soft click. I waited until I heard the shower running upstairs, then moved to where she'd left her phone on the side table. It was locked, of course, but the screen showed 3 missed text notifications from VA, Victor Ashworth presumably. The most recent one, visible in the preview, read, "Can't wait for tomorrow. I have something special planned for—" The rest was cut off, hidden behind the lock screen. Something special planned. For a business meeting. On a Saturday morning, I set the phone back exactly where she'd left it and walked to the kitchen window, staring out at our quiet suburban street. The Henderson account, the one that was supposedly so important, belonged to a mid-sized manufacturing company that specialized in industrial cleaning supplies. I knew this because I'd done some electrical work for their main facility last year. Nice people, but hardly the kind of high-stakes client that would require weekend meetings and special dinner preparations. The shower stopped running upstairs. I heard Lorraine moving around the bedroom, opening and closing drawers, the soft whisper of fabric against skin as she changed into whatever she wore to bed these days. We'd stopped sharing that particular intimacy months ago, another small shift in the geography of our marriage. When she came back downstairs to get her wine glass, she was wearing the silk pajamas I'd given her for Christmas, the ones she'd claimed were too fancy for everyday wear. "Don't stay up too late," she said, kissing my cheek with lips that tasted like wine and secrets. "I won't." But I did stay up, long after her breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep upstairs. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, thinking about different worlds and work dinners and the way she'd said Victor's name like it was something precious. By morning, I'd made a decision. If Lorraine was living in a different world now, it was time I learned the geography. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made everything look slightly out of focus. I was in the garage by 7, ostensibly organizing my tools but actually watching through the window as Lorraine prepared for her business meeting. She'd been up since 6, which was unusual for a weekend. Through the kitchen window, I could see her moving around with purposeful energy, checking her appearance in the hallway mirror, adjusting her hair, reapplying lipstick. The outfit she'd chosen was interesting. A navy blue dress that was professional enough for an office meeting, but fitted enough to suggest other possibilities. She paired it with heels that added 3 inches to her height and a confidence to her walk that I hadn't seen in months. At 9:30, she appeared in the garage doorway, car keys jingling in her manicured hand. "I'm heading out," she announced. "The meeting might run long, so don't wait up if I'm not back by dinner time." "What time did you say it started?" 10. She glanced at her watch, a new piece I didn't recognize. "I want to get there early, review my notes in the car." "Where's the meeting?" "Victor's office. He likes to work weekends when the building's quiet. Says it helps him focus." She was already backing toward her car, clearly eager to leave. "I'll call you later. Let you know how it goes." I watched her drive away, then waited exactly 10 minutes before following in my pickup truck. Her silver sedan was easy to spot in weekend traffic, and I stayed far enough back to avoid detection while keeping her in sight. She didn't head toward the Ashworth Industries building downtown. Instead, she took the highway exit toward Millfield, an upscale suburb about 20 minutes outside town. I followed at a distance, my curiosity growing with each mile. She eventually turned into the parking lot of the Millfield Country Club, a sprawling complex of manicured lawns and expensive cars that I'd only seen from the outside. I parked across the street at a gas station and watched through binoculars I'd grabbed from my toolbox. Lorraine sat in her car for several minutes, checking her appearance in the rearview mirror, applying another coat of lipstick. At exactly 10 o'clock, a black BMW pulled into the space beside her. Even from a distance, I recognized Victor Ashworth from the company newsletter photos Lorraine occasionally brought home. He was tall, silver-haired, probably in his late 40s, with the kind of polished confidence that came from never having to worry about money. He climbed out of his car wearing golf attire, polo shirt, khakis, expensive shoes that had never seen a construction site. Lorraine got out of her car, and they embraced. Not a handshake, not a professional greeting, but a full embrace that lasted several seconds longer than business associates typically managed. They walked toward the country club together, Victor's hand resting on the small of her back in a gesture that was unmistakably possessive. I sat in my truck for an hour, watching the entrance, fighting the urge to march inside and confront them. But confrontation wasn't going to give me the information I needed. If I wanted to understand what was really happening, I needed evidence, not just suspicion. At 11:30, I drove to the Ashworth Industries building downtown. The parking garage was nearly empty, just a few cars belonging to weekend security staff. Victor's reserved parking space was vacant. So much for the office meeting. I spent the rest of the day doing actual work around the house, fixing the basement plumbing and organizing the garage as promised. But my mind kept returning to that embrace in the country club parking lot, the way Victor's hand had settled on Lorraine's back, like he'd done it 100 times before. Lorraine came home at 8:30, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly mussed despite obvious attempts to repair it. "How was the meeting?" I asked, looking up from the carburetor I was cleaning at the kitchen table. "Productive. Very productive." She kicked off her heels and rubbed her feet. "Victor's really impressed with my presentation ideas. He thinks the Henderson account is as good as secured." "That's great. Where did you end up having dinner?" She paused, her hand frozen halfway to the refrigerator handle. "Dinner? You said the meeting might extend into dinner." "Oh, right." She opened the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of water. "We ended up working straight through. Ordered sandwiches to the office. Nothing fancy." "Sandwiches sound good for a working dinner." "Exactly. All business." She avoided my eyes, focusing intently on unscrewing the water bottle cap. "How was your day? Get that plumbing finished?" "Finally. And I found something interesting while I was organizing the garage." Her head snapped up. "Oh?" I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a business card. Cream-colored paper, expensive printing, the kind of thing that cost more per card than most people spent on lunch. "This was in that box of your work papers. Fell out when I was moving things around." She took the card, her expression carefully neutral. It was for a restaurant called Chez Laurent, an upscale French place about 30 miles outside town. On the back, someone had written "Our Place" in handwriting that definitely wasn't Lorraine's. "I have no idea where that came from," she said, but her voice had gone up half an octave. "Probably something from a client meeting months ago." Must have been some client meeting. "Gerald, what are you implying?" I stood up, wiping my hands on a shop rag. "I'm not implying anything. Just curious about the handwriting." She studied the card again, her jaw tightening. It could be anyone's handwriting. Mandy, maybe, or one of the other assistants. We're always exchanging restaurant recommendations. Mandy Sloan, her best friend from the office, who served as both confidant and alibi for an increasing number of Lorraine's activities. I'd met Mandy several times at company parties, a sharp-tongued woman in her 30s who seemed to view marriage as a temporary inconvenience rather than a commitment. "Right," I said. "Restaurant recommendations." "That's all it is." She tossed the card onto the counter with forced casualness. "I'm going to take a bath. It's been a long day." She disappeared upstairs, and I heard the bathroom door close, followed by the sound of running water. I picked up the business card and studied the handwriting more carefully. The letters were bold, confident, written with an expensive pen, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone accustomed to signing important documents. I photographed the card with my phone, then slipped it back into the box where I'd supposedly found it. If Lorraine wanted to check whether I was telling the truth about its discovery, she'd find it exactly where she expected. While she was in the bath, I did some research on my laptop. Chez Laurent had a website featuring photos of intimate dining rooms, candlelit tables, and a wine list that would have covered our mortgage payment. The kind of place where business associates definitely didn't meet to discuss quarterly projections. Their reservation system was online, and after a few minutes of creative navigation, I managed to access their booking calendar for the past few months. Sure enough, there were regular reservations under the name Ashworth, always for 2 people, always on weekday evenings, always at tables described as romantic or private. The most recent reservation was for next Tuesday at 8 o'clock. I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair, processing what I'd learned. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The country club meeting that wasn't at the office, the restaurant card with intimate handwriting, the pattern of reservations that coincided with Lorraine's work dinners. Taken individually, each piece could be explained away. Together, they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The bathwater was still running upstairs. I could hear Lorraine moving around, probably lighting the candles she'd started keeping in the bathroom, another small luxury that had appeared in our house without explanation. I thought about confronting her directly, demanding answers, forcing the truth into the open. But confrontation would only drive the deception deeper underground. If I wanted to know what was really happening, I needed more than suspicion and circumstantial evidence. I needed proof. The next few days passed in a careful dance of normalcy. Lorraine went to work, came home at reasonable hours, made conversation about office politics and client presentations. I worked on various projects around the house, fixed Mrs. Kavanaugh's leaky faucet next door, submitted bids for 2 new construction jobs. But underneath the surface routine, I was watching and listening and learning. I started paying attention to her phone habits, noting when she received texts and how she responded to them. I observed her clothing choices, the way she styled her hair, the perfume she wore on different days. I tracked her schedule, comparing what she told me with what I could verify. The pattern that emerged was subtle but consistent. Every Tuesday and Thursday she dressed with extra care. Every Tuesday and Thursday she came home slightly later than usual, her explanations just a touch too detailed. Every Tuesday and Thursday she received multiple text messages that made her smile in ways I hadn't seen in months. On Thursday evening, I decided to test my theory. "How was your day?" I asked as she settled into her armchair with her usual glass of wine. "Busy. Victor had me working on the Morrison account presentation. Lots of details to coordinate." She tucked her legs under her, getting comfortable. "How about you? Finished the Hendricks bathroom?" "Almost. Should be done tomorrow." I paused, pretending to remember something. "Oh, I ran into Tom Morrison at the hardware store today. Nice guy." She went very still. "Tom Morrison." "Yeah, from Morrison Industries. He mentioned he's been working with a new vendor for his office renovations. Said the presentation went really well last week." Her wine glass was halfway to her lips, frozen there while she processed what I'd said. That's nice. Funny thing, though, he said the presentation was on Wednesday, not Thursday, and it was handled by Victor's other assistant, not you." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Lorraine set down her wine glass with careful precision, her mind clearly racing through possible explanations. "There must be some confusion," she finally said. "We've been working on several Morrison projects. Tom probably mixed up the details." Probably. But we both knew I was lying about meeting Tom Morrison, and she was lying about working on his account, and the careful architecture of deception we'd been building was starting to show cracks. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I sat in the kitchen with my laptop and a cup of coffee, researching Victor Ashworth. Public records, social media, business profiles, anything that might give me insight into the man who was apparently sharing intimate dinners with my wife. What I found was interesting. Victor was married, had been for 15 years to a woman named Patricia, who appeared frequently in society page photos. They lived in a mansion in the most expensive part of town, belonged to the country club where I'd seen him meet Lorraine, and maintained the kind of public profile that suggested a stable, successful marriage. But successful marriages didn't typically involve secret dinners with subordinates at romantic French restaurants. I dug deeper, looking for any hint of previous scandals or indiscretions. Victor Ashworth kept a clean public image, but power and opportunity had a way of creating temptation. And from what I'd observed, he wasn't the kind of man who denied himself anything he wanted, including, apparently, my wife. By Tuesday, I'd made my decision. If Lorraine was meeting Victor at Chez Laurent, I was going to be there to document it. Not to confront them, that could wait, but to gather the kind of evidence that would make denial impossible. I spent Tuesday afternoon preparing. I borrowed a decent camera from my friend Emmett, who did wedding photography on weekends. I researched the restaurant's layout, studying photos and reviews to understand sightlines and seating arrangements. I even called and made a reservation for myself, claiming I wanted to surprise my wife for our anniversary. At 7:30, I was parked across the street from Chez Laurent, camera ready, waiting to see if my suspicions would be confirmed. At 8 o'clock exactly, Victor's black BMW pulled into the restaurant's parking lot. 2 minutes later, Lorraine's silver sedan followed. They met at the entrance, another embrace, another possessive hand on her back as they disappeared inside. Through the restaurant's large windows, I could see them being seated at a corner table, intimate and secluded, the kind of spot reserved for couples celebrating special occasions. I took photos, lots of photos. The embrace, the intimate seating, the way they leaned toward each other across the table, the moment when Victor reached across to touch her hand. They stayed for 2 hours. When they finally emerged, they stood in the parking lot talking for another 20 minutes, reluctant to end the evening. Their final embrace lasted long enough for me to capture it from 3 different angles. I followed Lorraine home, staying far enough back to avoid detection. She arrived 15 minutes after I did, having stopped somewhere to repair her appearance and construct her story. "How was your evening?" I asked as she came through the front door. "Long. Victor needed me to stay late to finish the quarterly reports." She hung up her coat, avoiding eye contact. I grabbed a sandwich from the vending machine. "Nothing exciting." "Sounds like a demanding job." "It is, but it's worth it for the opportunities." She moved toward the stairs, clearly eager to end the conversation. "I'm exhausted. Going to bed early tonight." I watched her climb the stairs, then transferred the photos from the camera to my laptop. The evidence was clear and damning. My wife and her boss, sharing an intimate dinner at a romantic restaurant, behaving like lovers rather than colleagues. The question now was what to do with the information. Confrontation would lead to denials, explanations, promises to end whatever was happening. But I'd learned enough about deception over the past week to know that promises made under pressure rarely lasted. If I wanted this to end permanently, I needed a different approach. Something that would make continuing the affair impossible. Something that would have consequences beyond our marriage. I thought about Victor Ashworth's public profile, his position in the community, his 15-year marriage to Patricia. I thought about the company he ran, the employees who depended on him for their livelihoods, the shareholders who trusted him with their investments. Men in Victor's position had a lot to lose when their private indiscretions became public knowledge. And sometimes the threat of exposure was more powerful than exposure itself. I spent the rest of the night planning my next move, and by morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Wednesday morning brought the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem sharper, more focused. I was up before dawn, drinking coffee in the kitchen while Lorraine slept upstairs, planning the first phase of what I'd started thinking of as my education in consequences. My friend Malcolm Reeves worked as an investigative reporter for the local newspaper, the kind of old-school journalist who still believed in following leads and asking uncomfortable questions. We'd been friends since high school, bonded by our shared skepticism about authority and our appreciation for well-crafted sarcasm. Malcolm also had a reputation for discretion when sources needed protection and ruthlessness when powerful people tried to hide behind their positions. I called him at 8 o'clock after Lorraine had left for work. "Gerald Tate," he answered on the second ring. "What's the emergency? You never call this early unless something's broken or someone's in trouble." "Maybe both," I said. "You busy for lunch?" "For you? I can make time. What's this about?" "Victor Ashworth." There was a pause, the kind that suggested Malcolm's reporter instincts had just activated. "The Ashworth Industries guy? What about him?" "Let's just say I've stumbled across some information that might interest you. Information about how he conducts business." "What kind of business?" "The kind that involves expensive dinners and creative interpretations of professional boundaries." Another pause, longer this time. "Gerald, please tell me you're not about to confess to something that's going to end up on the police blotter." "Nothing like that, but I think you'll find the conversation educational." We agreed to meet at Murphy's Tavern, a dive bar on the outskirts of town that served surprisingly good burgers and minded its own business about who was having what conversations. The kind of place where a contractor and a reporter could talk without attracting attention. I spent the morning working on a kitchen renovation for the Hendricks family, installing cabinet hardware and trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy while my mind raced through possible scenarios. By the time I met Malcolm for lunch, I'd rehearsed my approach several times. Malcolm was already seated in a corner booth when I arrived, nursing a beer and reviewing notes on his phone. He looked up as I approached, his expression curious but cautious. "You look like hell," he observed as I slid into the seat across from him. "Thanks. You always know just what to say." "Seriously, though, what's going on? You sounded strange on the phone." I ordered a beer from the waitress, then pulled out my phone and showed Malcolm one of the photos I'd taken outside chez Laurent. Victor and Lorraine embracing in the parking lot, her hand resting on his chest, both of them looking like they had nowhere else they'd rather be. Malcolm studied the photo for a long moment, then looked up at me with understanding in his eyes. "Ah, I see." He set the phone down carefully. "How long?" "I'm not sure. A few months, maybe longer. I only started paying attention recently." "And you want me to do what exactly? Expose the affair? Ruin his reputation?" "I want you to investigate Victor Ashworth's business practices. The affair is just context." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Context for what?" I pulled out a folder I'd prepared, containing copies of documents I'd found in Lorraine's briefcase over the past few weeks. Vendor contracts, expense reports, correspondence with clients, all the paperwork she'd been bringing home to review in the evenings. "Take a look at these," I said, spreading the documents across the table. Malcolm examined them with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years following paper trails. After a few minutes, he looked up with interest. "These vendor contracts," he said, tapping one of the documents. "The companies don't exist." "That's what I thought. I ran searches on all of them. No business licenses, no tax records, no physical addresses that aren't post office boxes." And your wife prepared these? According to the signatures and dates, yes, but I don't think she understands what she's signing. She sees them as routine paperwork, part of her job responsibilities. Malcolm continued studying the documents, his expression growing more serious. Gerald, if these are legitimate contracts for non-existent companies, we're looking at fraud, potentially serious fraud depending on the amounts involved. The amounts are serious. Each contract is worth between $50,000 and $200,000. And they're all signed by Victor Ashworth. Everyone. Malcolm sat back in his chair, processing the implications. So, either your wife is involved in a major embezzlement scheme, or she's being used as an unwitting accomplice by her boss. Given what I know about Lorraine, I'd say unwitting accomplice. She's many things, but she's not stupid enough to put her signature on documents she knew were fraudulent. But Victor Ashworth might be arrogant enough to think he could get away with it, especially if he had a loyal assistant who didn't ask too many questions. Exactly. The waitress brought our food, and we paused the conversation while she set down plates and refilled our drinks. When she was gone, Malcolm leaned forward, his voice lower. What do you want from me, Gerald? And don't say justice or revenge or any of that philosophical stuff. What's your actual goal here? I took a sip of my beer, considering my answer. I want the affair to end. Permanently. And I want Victor Ashworth to understand that there are consequences for treating other people's marriages as his personal entertainment. And if Lorraine gets caught in the crossfire? She made her choices. Now she gets to live with the results. Malcolm nodded slowly. I can investigate this. If the fraud is as extensive as these documents suggest, it'll make a hell of a story. But once I start digging, I can't control where it leads or who gets hurt. I understand. And you're prepared for the possibility that this could end your marriage? I thought about the question, really considered it. The marriage I'd thought I had was already over, had been over for months, probably. What remained was just the pretense, the comfortable lies we told ourselves to avoid difficult conversations. The marriage ended when she started having intimate dinners with another man, I said finally. I'm just making it official. Malcolm gathered up the documents and slipped them into his briefcase. I'll need a few days to verify this information and track down additional sources. Can you get me more documentation? Probably. She brings work home most evenings. Be careful, Gerald. If Victor Ashworth is as smart as his reputation suggests, he's not going to take kindly to being exposed. And if he figures out where the leak came from, let me worry about that. We finished our lunch making small talk about mutual friends and local politics, but the real conversation was over. Malcolm had his story, and I had set events in motion that couldn't be undone. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose, of forward momentum. For weeks, I'd been reacting to Lorraine's deception, trying to understand what was happening and why. Now I was taking action, shaping events rather than simply enduring them. That evening, Lorraine came home in an unusually good mood, humming while she prepared dinner and chatting about her day with genuine enthusiasm. Victor's been so pleased with my work lately, she said, stirring pasta sauce at the stove. He's hinting about another promotion, possibly to junior executive level. That's great news. It really is. The salary increase alone would change everything for us. We could finally afford to finish the renovations, maybe even take that vacation we've been talking about. She was glowing with excitement, her face animated in a way I hadn't seen in years. It occurred to me that this was probably how she looked when she was with Victor, alive, engaged, full of possibility. When would this promotion happen? I asked. Soon, I think. Victor wants to announce it at the company retreat next month. He says timing is important for these things, that he needs to make sure all the pieces are in place. The company retreat. Another opportunity for them to spend time together away from the office, away from spouses and normal constraints. I wondered if Victor had promised her the promotion as a way of ensuring her continued cooperation, both professional and personal. Sounds like you've made quite an impression on him. I hope so. I've worked really hard to prove myself, to show him that I'm capable of handling more responsibility. She served dinner, and we ate while she talked about her plans for the new position, the projects she wanted to tackle, the respect she hoped to earn from her colleagues. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty about what I'd set in motion. Almost. After dinner, she disappeared upstairs to take a bath, leaving me to clean up the kitchen. While I loaded the dishwasher, her phone chimed with an incoming text. She'd left it on the counter, and the screen lit up with a message from VA. "Can't stop thinking about last night. You were incredible." I stared at the message, feeling the last of my guilt evaporate. Whatever promises Victor had made about promotions and career advancement, they weren't the real reason for their relationship. This was about desire, about the thrill of deception, about two people who thought they were clever enough to have everything they wanted without paying the price. They were about to learn otherwise. The phone chimed again. Another message from Victor. "Same time Thursday. I have something special planned." Something special. Like the promotion he dangled in front of her, or the romantic dinners at expensive restaurants, or the promises of a future that would never include the inconvenience of a husband who asked too many questions. I finished cleaning the kitchen and went to my workshop in the garage, where I spent the evening organizing tools and thinking about timing. Malcolm would need a few days to verify the documents and develop additional sources. The newspaper would want to fact-check everything before publication. The whole process would take at least a week, possibly 2, which meant I had time to gather more evidence, to build a case so comprehensive that denial would be impossible. Thursday evening, I was ready with the camera when Lorraine left for her late meeting. This time, I followed her to a different restaurant, an intimate Italian place downtown, where Victor was already waiting at a secluded table. I documented everything: their arrival, their obvious familiarity with the staff, the way they held hands across the table, the kiss they shared in the parking lot afterward. The photos were even more damning than the ones from earlier in the week. When Lorraine came home 2 hours later, she found me reading in the living room. "How was your meeting?" I asked without looking up from my book. "Productive. We're making real progress on the Morrison account." The same fictional account she'd mentioned before, the same careful lie delivered with the same practiced sincerity. "That's good to hear." She kissed the top of my head, a gesture that felt more like habit than affection, and headed upstairs. I listened to her moving around the bedroom, getting ready for bed, probably texting Victor about their evening together. In the morning, I'd call Malcolm and give him the additional photos. By next week, the investigation would be complete, and Victor Ashworth's carefully constructed world would begin to collapse. I thought about Lorraine's excitement over her promised promotion, her plans for our future, her belief that she could manage both her marriage and her affair without consequences. She was about to discover that some choices couldn't be undone, and some secrets couldn't be kept forever. The education in consequences was about to begin. Friday morning arrived with the kind of gray, oppressive sky that suggested rain was coming whether anyone wanted it or not. I was in the garage early, pretending to work on my truck's engine while actually watching Lorraine prepare for another day at the office. She'd been up since 6, longer than usual in the shower, more careful with her makeup. Through the kitchen window, I could see her moving with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested something important was happening today. When she finally appeared in the garage doorway, she was wearing a new dress I'd never seen before, something expensive-looking in deep blue that complemented her eyes and fit her figure in ways that were clearly intentional. "Big day today?" I asked, wiping my hands on a shop rag. "Victor's announcing some organizational changes. He wants all the senior staff to look their best for the presentation." She adjusted her pearl necklace, the one I'd given her for our anniversary that had become a regular part of her Victor meeting attire. "How do I look?" "Professional," I said, which was true as far as it went. She also looked like a woman dressing to impress a man who wasn't her husband, but pointing that out would have been counterproductive. I should be home at the usual time tonight. Victor's flying to Boston this afternoon for a weekend conference. Interesting. If Victor was going to be out of town, Lorraine would be spending Friday evening at home for the first time in weeks. No mysterious late meetings, no urgent projects that required dinner discussions. Sounds like you'll have a quiet weekend then. Probably. Catch up on some reading, maybe work in the garden if the weather improves. She glanced at her watch, another new piece I didn't recognize. I should go. Don't want to be late when Victor's making announcements. After she left, I called Malcolm. Please tell me you have good news, he answered. I've been digging into those documents you gave me, and what I'm finding is making my editor very happy. How happy? Front page happy. Gerald, this isn't just embezzlement we're looking at. Victor Ashworth has been running a sophisticated shell game for at least 2 years, possibly longer. Those fake vendor contracts are just the tip of the iceberg. I felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with apprehension. What else did you find? Kickbacks from real vendors, inflated consulting fees, phantom employees on the payroll. The man's been treating Ashworth Industries like his personal piggy bank. Malcolm paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. The total amount we can document is approaching $2 million. $2 million. Suddenly, the expensive restaurants and new jewelry made more sense. Victor hadn't just been conducting an affair, he'd been funding it with stolen money. What about Lorraine's involvement? That's where it gets complicated. Her signature is on a lot of the paperwork, but the pattern suggests she was signing documents without understanding their true purpose. A good lawyer could probably argue she was an unwitting accomplice. But she's still legally vulnerable. Absolutely. Ignorance isn't a complete defense, especially when someone's in a position to know what they're signing. I thought about Lorraine's excitement over her promised promotion, her plans for our future financed by Victor's embezzled funds. She might not have understood the mechanics of what she was signing, but she'd certainly been willing to benefit from the results. When does the story run? Monday morning. My editor wants to give the company a chance to respond, so we'll be contacting their legal department this afternoon. Which meant Victor would know about the investigation before he left for Boston. His weekend conference was about to become considerably more stressful. Malcolm, I need to ask you something. When this story breaks, is there any way to trace the source back to me? Not unless you want it traced back. As far as anyone knows, an anonymous source provided the documents to the newspaper. Your name doesn't appear anywhere in my notes or files. Good. Because I have a feeling Victor Ashworth isn't going to take this well. Men like Victor never do. They're used to controlling the narrative, managing the consequences. When that control gets taken away... Malcolm trailed off, but I understood his meaning. Powerful men who felt cornered were capable of dangerous decisions. I spent the rest of Friday working on legitimate projects, trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy while my mind raced through possible scenarios. By evening, Victor would know that his embezzlement scheme had been exposed. By Monday morning, the story would be public, and his carefully constructed life would begin to unravel. The question was how he would react, and whether he'd figure out that the leak had come from someone close to home. Lorraine came home at her usual time, but her mood was subdued, almost distracted. The organizational announcement Victor had promised apparently hadn't gone as expected. How was the big presentation? I asked, as she settled into her armchair with a glass of wine. Postponed. Victor got called away on urgent business, some kind of legal matter that needed his immediate attention. She sipped her wine, her expression troubled. He seemed really stressed about it, more than I've ever seen him. Legal matter. Malcolm's editor had wasted no time contacting Ashworth Industries for their response to the upcoming story. Victor was probably spending his Friday evening with lawyers instead of preparing for his Boston conference. I'm sure he'll handle whatever it is, I said. Successful executives deal with legal issues all the time. I suppose. It's just that he's been so positive lately, so focused on expansion and new opportunities. This seemed to really shake him. New opportunities funded by embezzled money, expansion financed by fraud. Victor's positive outlook had been based on his ability to steal with impunity. Now that his crimes were about to be exposed, optimism was probably in short supply. These things have a way of working themselves out, I said. Lorraine nodded absently, but I could see her mind working through possibilities, trying to understand why Victor had seemed so rattled by what he'd described as routine legal business. We spent the evening watching television, making small talk about weekend plans and household projects, but underneath the surface normalcy, I could feel tension building like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Saturday morning brought rain, steady and persistent, the kind that made outdoor work impossible and indoor projects seem more appealing. I was in the basement finally finishing the plumbing repairs I'd been working on for weeks, when I heard Lorraine's phone ring upstairs. Her voice carried down through the heating vents, agitated and concerned in a way that made me stop working and listen. "Victor, slow down. I can barely understand what you're saying." A long pause, then. "What do you mean, investigation? What kind of investigation?" Another pause, longer this time, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone up an octave. "The newspaper? But how could they—" "Victor, I don't understand. What documents?" I climbed the stairs quietly, positioning myself where I could hear both sides of the conversation through the kitchen door. "No, I never talked to any reporters. Why would I talk to reporters?" Lorraine was pacing now, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Victor, you're scaring me. What exactly are they saying about the company?" The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, Lorraine's voice growing more distressed, as Victor apparently explained the scope of the investigation. When she finally hung up, I heard her sink into a chair, followed by the sound of sobbing. I gave her a few minutes to compose herself, then walked into the kitchen as if I'd just come in from the garage. "Everything okay?" I asked. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and a face that had gone pale beneath her makeup. "There's going to be an article in Monday's paper, about the company, about Victor." "What kind of article?" "They're saying—" She stopped, took a shaky breath, started again. "They're alleging financial irregularities, fraud. They have documents, contracts that they claim are fake." I sat down across from her, arranging my expression into what I hoped looked like concern rather than satisfaction. "That sounds serious. Victor says it's all lies, that someone's trying to destroy the company. But Gerald, some of those contracts, I prepared some of those contracts. My signature is on them. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. If you were doing your job properly, following Victor's instructions. But what if I wasn't? What if I was signing things I shouldn't have been signing?" She looked at me with genuine fear in her eyes. "What if I'm in trouble too?" It was a reasonable fear. Even if she'd been an unwitting accomplice, her signature on fraudulent documents made her legally vulnerable. The promotion Victor had promised was looking increasingly unlikely, and the future she'd been planning was crumbling along with his embezzlement scheme. "Did Victor explain how the newspaper got these documents?" "He doesn't know. Someone provided them anonymously. He thinks it might be a disgruntled employee, or maybe a competitor trying to damage the company's reputation. Or maybe a husband who'd gotten tired of being treated like he didn't exist, but I kept that thought to myself. What happens now?" "Victor's lawyers are trying to stop publication, but he doesn't think they'll succeed. The story's going to run on Monday, and then—" She trailed off, staring out the rain-streaked window. "Then everything changes." Everything had already changed, but she was just beginning to understand the scope of the transformation. Her affair with Victor had seemed like a private matter, a secret that affected only the people directly involved. Now it was about to become part of a public scandal that would destroy careers, end marriages, and possibly result in criminal charges. The education in consequences was proceeding exactly as planned. That evening, Lorraine barely touched her dinner, spending most of the meal staring at her phone as if willing it to ring with good news that wasn't coming. When Victor finally called around 9 o'clock, their conversation was brief and tense. "He's flying back from Boston tomorrow," she told me after hanging up. "The lawyers want to meet first thing Monday morning, before the paper hits the stands." "Sounds like they're taking it seriously." "Victor says we need to be prepared for media attention, maybe even investigators asking questions. He wants me to refer all inquiries to the company's legal department." Even facing potential criminal charges, she was still thinking in terms of her partnership with Victor, still seeing herself as part of his team, rather than as a woman who'd been manipulated into signing fraudulent documents. "That seems like good advice." She nodded, but I could see doubt creeping into her expression, questions she was afraid to ask but couldn't entirely suppress. For the first time since the affair began, she was being forced to consider the possibility that Victor Ashworth wasn't the man she thought he was. Sunday passed quietly, both of us pretending to read, pretending to watch television, pretending that tomorrow wouldn't bring revelations that would change everything. Lorraine's phone remained silent. Apparently, Victor was too busy with damage control to maintain their usual constant communication. By evening, she'd retreated into herself, speaking only when necessary, moving through the house like someone walking through a minefield. "Are you going to work tomorrow?" I asked as we prepared for bed. "I have to. Victor needs me there, especially now." She paused in brushing her hair, meeting my eyes in the bedroom mirror. "Gerald, whatever happens with this newspaper story, whatever they're saying about the company, I want you to know that I never intended for anything like this to happen." It was the closest she'd come to acknowledging that there was more to her relationship with Victor than professional duties, and for a moment I considered telling her that I knew everything, about the dinners, the embraces, the intimate text messages. But confrontation could wait. Tomorrow, when the story broke and Victor's world collapsed, would be soon enough for complete honesty. "I know," I said instead. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a difficult day." She nodded and turned out the light, but I could tell from her breathing that sleep was going to be elusive. She was lying in the dark, probably thinking about fraudulent contracts and newspaper investigations and the possibility that her promising career was about to become a criminal liability. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain against the windows, thinking about the story that would appear in tomorrow's paper and the chain of events it would set in motion. By this time next week, Victor Ashworth would be facing criminal charges, his marriage would be over, and his reputation would be destroyed. And Lorraine would finally understand that actions had consequences, even when you thought nobody was watching, especially when nobody was watching. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth and brilliant sunshine, the kind of weather that made everything look deceptively cheerful. I was up before dawn, drinking coffee in the kitchen, while Lorraine slept fitfully upstairs, preparing for what I knew would be the most significant day in our 20-year marriage. The newspaper arrived at 6:30, and Malcolm had delivered exactly as promised. The headline stretched across the front page in bold letters: "Local CEO accused of massive embezzlement scheme." Below it, a smaller subheading read, "Ashworth Industries executive allegedly stole over $2 million through fake vendor contracts." The article was thorough and damning, laying out the details of Victor's fraud with the kind of methodical precision that made denial impossible. Malcolm had done his homework, tracing money through shell companies, documenting patterns of deception, and providing enough evidence to support every allegation. Lorraine's name appeared several times throughout the article, identified as the executive assistant who had processed many of the fraudulent contracts. The reporting was careful to note that her level of knowledge about the scheme remained unclear, but the implication was obvious. She was either a co-conspirator or a remarkably naive accomplice. I was reading the article for the third time when I heard Lorraine's alarm go off upstairs, followed by the sound of her getting ready for what she didn't yet know would be the worst day of her professional life. She came downstairs 20 minutes later, dressed for another day at the office, her hair perfectly styled and her makeup carefully applied. She looked like someone preparing for battle, which was probably more accurate than she realized. "Morning," she said, moving toward the coffee maker with the kind of determined efficiency that suggested she was trying to maintain normalcy through routine. "Morning." I folded the newspaper and set it beside my coffee cup, waiting to see how long it would take her to notice. She poured her coffee, added cream, took a sip, then glanced at the newspaper. I watched her face change as she read the headline, watched the color drain from her cheeks as the implications sank in. "Oh my God!" She grabbed the paper with shaking hands, scanning the article with growing horror. "Oh my God, Gerald, this is comprehensive," I suggested. She looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes. "They have everything: documents, financial records, even quotes from former employees. How did they get all of this?" "Investigative journalism. It's what newspapers do when they smell a big story." She continued reading, and I could see her finding her own name in the text, seeing herself described as a key figure in Victor's embezzlement scheme. When she reached the paragraph that detailed her signature on dozens of fraudulent contracts, she actually gasped. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Gerald, I swear to you, I had no idea what those contracts really were." I believe you. And I did believe her, at least about the contracts. Lorraine was many things, but she wasn't stupid enough to knowingly participate in a $2 million fraud scheme. She'd been used, manipulated by a man who'd convinced her that her value extended beyond her professional skills. Her phone rang, and Victor's name appeared on the screen. She answered on the second ring. "Victor, I just saw the paper. How bad is this?" Her voice was shaking, and she had to sit down to continue the conversation. "What do you mean, don't come in? Victor, I need to work. I need to—" She listened for several minutes, her expression growing more distressed as Victor apparently explained the reality of their situation. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Suspended? But Victor, I didn't do anything wrong. I was just following your instructions." Another long pause. "What do you mean legal representation? Why would I need a lawyer?" The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but the essential message was clear. Ashworth Industries was in full damage control mode, which meant distancing themselves from anyone associated with the scandal. Lorraine's suspension was probably just the first step toward termination, and Victor's suggestion that she obtain legal representation indicated that criminal charges were a real possibility. When she hung up, she sat staring at the phone for a long moment, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd heard. "I've been suspended," she said finally, "pending the outcome of the investigation. That's probably standard procedure in situations like this. Victor says the FBI might want to interview me. The FBI, Gerald. They think I might be a criminal." She started crying then, not the delicate tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the harsh, ugly sobs of someone whose world had just collapsed. I watched her for a moment, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and something that might have been pity. This was what I'd wanted: consequences for her choices, an end to the deception that had been poisoning our marriage. But seeing her reduced to this broken, frightened woman was less satisfying than I'd expected. "Lorraine," I said gently, "there's something we need to talk about." She looked up at me through her tears. "What?" "I know about the affair." The words hit her like a physical blow. She went completely still, her crying stopped, and for a moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the ticking of the wall clock. "What are you talking about?" "I know about the dinners at Chez Laurent. I know about the meetings at the country club. I know about the text messages and the embraces in parking lots." I kept my voice calm, matter of fact. I've known for weeks. She stared at me, her mind clearly racing through memories, trying to figure out how much I'd discovered and how I'd discovered it. Gerald, I can explain. You don't need to explain. I understand perfectly. You fell in love with your boss, or thought you did. He made you feel important, valued, appreciated in ways that I apparently couldn't. You started having an affair. It wasn't supposed to happen. It just happened. I know. These things always just happen. I stood up and refilled my coffee cup, giving her time to process. The question now is what happens next. What do you mean? I mean that your affair with Victor Ashworth is about to become public knowledge. When the FBI starts investigating this embezzlement scheme, they're going to look at everyone in Victor's orbit. They're going to examine his relationships, his motivations, his methods of ensuring loyalty. The implications were sinking in now. An affair between a CEO and his assistant would be seen as relevant to the fraud investigation, especially when the assistant had signed so many of the questionable documents. They'll think he was using me, she whispered. Weren't he? She opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. Because of course Victor had been using her. For intimacy, for companionship, for someone to sign documents without asking too many questions. The promotion he'd promised, the future he'd painted, had all been tools to secure her compliance. What am I going to do? She asked. You're going to hire a good lawyer. You're going to cooperate with the investigation, and you're going to hope that the FBI believes you were a victim rather than a co-conspirator. And us? What happens to us? I looked at her sitting at our kitchen table, her perfect makeup ruined by tears, her carefully planned life in ruins around her. 6 months ago, I would have comforted her, would have promised that we'd get through this together, would have stood by her regardless of the consequences. But 6 months ago, she hadn't been having an affair with another man. I don't know, I said honestly. That depends on a lot of things that haven't been decided yet. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and damage control. Lorraine spent hours on the phone with lawyers, trying to find someone who specialized in white-collar defense and was available immediately. The few who agreed to meet with her made it clear that her situation was serious. Even if she'd been an unwitting accomplice, her signature on fraudulent documents made her legally vulnerable. Meanwhile, the media attention was intensifying. By noon, news vans were parked outside the Ashworth Industries building, and reporters were calling anyone connected to the company. Our phone rang constantly until I finally unplugged it. Mrs. Tate? A voice called from our front porch around 2 o'clock. I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. Could we have a few words about your connection to the Ashworth Industries investigation? Lorraine peered through the living room curtains at the reporter and camera crew on our lawn, then looked at me with panic in her eyes. What do I do? Nothing. You don't talk to reporters without your lawyer present. That's legal representation 101. She nodded and retreated to the bedroom, leaving me to deal with the media attention. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, facing the reporter with what I hoped looked like confused innocence. I'm sorry, but my wife isn't available for comment, I said. She's following her attorney's advice to refer all questions to Ashworth Industries' legal department. Mr. Tate, are you aware that your wife's signature appears on dozens of contracts that are now being investigated as fraudulent? I'm aware that my wife did her job professionally and thoroughly, following the instructions of her supervisors. Beyond that, I have no comment. The reporter tried a few more questions, but I maintained my position of polite non-cooperation until they finally gave up and left. But I knew they'd be back. This story had all the elements that made for compelling television, and Lorraine's role as the assistant who'd signed the fraudulent documents made her a key figure in the narrative. That evening, Victor's arrest made the 6 o'clock news. The footage showed him being led from his mansion in handcuffs, his wife watching from the doorway with an expression of shock and humiliation. The charges included embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy, serious federal crimes that carried the possibility of decades in prison. Lorraine watched the coverage with growing horror, finally understanding that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a temporary setback. This was the complete destruction of everything Victor had built, and by extension, everything she'd thought she was building with him. "He looks so small," she said as the news moved on to other stories. "Prison jumpsuits have that effect on people." She turned to look at me, her expression haunted. "Gerald, how did this happen? How did everything fall apart so quickly?" "It didn't fall apart quickly. It was falling apart for months, maybe years. You just weren't paying attention to the right things." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you were so focused on what Victor was offering you, the promotion, the salary increase, the excitement of the affair, that you didn't notice what he was actually doing. You saw what you wanted to see." She was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of what I'd said. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely audible. "Did you know this was going to happen? When you said you knew about the affair, did you know about the investigation too?" It was a perceptive question, and I considered how to answer it. The truth was complicated. I'd suspected that Victor was using company resources to fund his lifestyle, but I hadn't known the extent of his crimes until Malcolm's investigation revealed the scope of the embezzlement. I knew Victor Ashworth was the kind of man who took what he wanted without worrying about the consequences, I said finally. I knew that men like that usually have secrets worth exposing. "So you exposed them." "I provided information to someone who knew how to use it properly." She stared at me for a long moment, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You gave those documents to the newspaper. I gave copies of documents that were sitting in our house to a journalist friend who specializes in investigating corporate fraud. What he did with them was his decision. You destroyed Victor. You destroyed me. Victor destroyed himself by committing crimes. You made your own choices about how to respond to his attention." I stood up, suddenly tired of the conversation. I just made sure that choices had consequences. "So this is revenge? All of this is because you were jealous?" "This is justice. There's a difference." I left her sitting in the living room, staring at the blank television screen, probably thinking about all the ways her life had changed in the space of a single day. The affair that had seemed so exciting and sophisticated in private was about to become a public scandal. The career advancement she'd been counting on had evaporated, along with Victor's freedom. The future she'd been planning was gone, replaced by legal bills and the possibility of criminal charges. The education in consequences was proceeding exactly as designed, but I was beginning to understand that consequences once set in motion were difficult to control. The satisfaction I'd expected to feel was tempered by the recognition that Lorraine's destruction was also, in many ways, my own. Our marriage, whatever remained of it, would not survive this revelation. The house we'd bought together, the life we'd built over 20 years, the shared history that had once seemed so solid, all of it was now contaminated by betrayal and revenge. I'd gotten what I wanted, but the victory felt more hollow than I'd anticipated. Outside, another news van pulled up to the curb, and I realized that tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, new humiliations, additional consequences that neither of us had fully considered. The education was far from over. The house went quiet in a way it never had before. Not the comfortable silence of two people sharing space, but the hollow kind, like a room after furniture's been hauled out, dust outlines still visible on the floor. Lorraine moved through the days like a guest overstaying her welcome, careful, polite, afraid to touch anything that might break again. By Wednesday, her lawyer had explained the situation in plain language. No arrest for now. Full cooperation. Emails surrendered. Phone records subpoenaed. The word unwitting used generously, but never promised. Victor, on the other hand, was denied bail. His wife had filed for divorce the same morning. Power evaporates fast when the headlines settle. Lorraine stopped wearing the pearls. She stopped wearing makeup at all most days. She sat at the kitchen table scrolling job listings she wasn't qualified for anymore, her name now radioactive in the industry she'd sacrificed everything to enter. Friends from work stopped calling. Mandy sent one text, "I'm so sorry. I can't talk right now," and then vanished. One evening, a week after the arrest, Lorraine broke the silence. "I didn't love him," she said suddenly, staring at her cold dinner. "I loved how I felt around him." I didn't answer. "He made me feel chosen," she continued, "like I finally mattered." I set my fork down. "You always mattered. Just not to the right person." She flinched, like I'd slapped her. That night, I slept on the couch. Not out of spite, out of clarity. Something fundamental had shifted. The marriage wasn't bleeding anymore, it was already gone, and we were just standing beside the body, arguing about who'd noticed first. 2 weeks later, I filed. The paperwork was mercifully simple. No kids, no hidden assets, just a house full of memories neither of us wanted to fight over. Lorraine didn't contest it. She signed where her lawyer told her to sign, the same way she always had. I moved into a small rental near my job sites. 1 bedroom, quiet street, cheap coffee shop on the corner where nobody knew my name or my story. I slept better than I had in years. The story ran its course. Victor pleaded not guilty, then cooperated. More names surfaced. Ashworth Industries collapsed under audits and lawsuits. Lorraine was never charged, but the stain didn't wash out. She took a temporary admin job at a non-profit 2 towns over, a long commute she didn't complain about. We spoke once more, months later, to finalize the house sale. "I don't hate you," she said at the end of the call. "I think that's the worst part." "I don't hate you either," I replied. "But I don't miss us." After that, we stopped speaking. On the day the last article ran, former CEO sentenced to 18 years. I didn't read it right away. I was under a sink replacing a rusted valve, water dripping down my arm, the radio playing softly in the background. A normal day, honest work, nothing hidden. That evening, Malcolm texted me. "You okay?" I replied, "Yeah. It's quiet now." And it was. People like Victor believe the world isn't watching, that power is a shield, that consequences are for smaller men. But they forget something important. Nobodies watch everything. We notice patterns, we keep receipts. And when the moment comes, we don't need to shout. We just let the truth speak. Because in the end, I really was nobody. And nobody noticed everything.